joining us this morning. Jesse had asked me to prepare this home composting presentation. So I have lots of great slides, and we'll be kind of discussing each one of them and the what to include, what not to include, and how to proceed with it. As with every other kind of technique in gardening, there are many ways to approach it, and you can adapt whichever one seems to be the most appropriate for the amount of time you want to put in, but also just the size of your garden, and whether it's just a couple of containers or whether it's a quarter acre that's flat and wonderful for being able to grow just about anything. But first, I wanted to invite all of you to join my website, which is gardeninginla.net. It has job opportunities if you're interested in trying to make some real money as a result of your passion for gardening. Also different events, like most everything these days, is certainly Zoom presentations, and also lots of resources both for the university, all the different kinds of websites dealing with edibles and ornamentals, and also non-University of California resources that are excellent resources of information. They're all science-based. And also on the web links page are several of the Zoom presentations that I've made to other groups, as well as Pasadena Grows, that you may like to go through those as well. My blog is about every other week. I talk about my garden here in Pasadena and just what's going on in the garden, with lots of photos and wondering why some things are working and some things aren't. And this will be, I think, of value to you because you can relate it to what's happening in your garden, and perhaps being able to demystify some of the curiosities that are happening in your garden. If you do want to receive the notices of my blog when I post it, and also job opportunities, you can email me at gardeninginla@gmail.com, and I'll add you to the mailing list. So let's move on to composting. This is really one of the magics, I think, in gardening. Okay, so you'll see, if you have been on my website already, you'll see this is kind of our logo. This happy compost pile was created at one of the community gardens when I ran the Master Gardener program for LA County. And by the way, if you are considering applying for the Master Gardener program for this next year, or if you would like to know what it's all about, the deadline is Monday afternoon at 4 o'clock. So what you can do is just Google Master Gardener Los Angeles County. You can also email me directly and I'll send you the link. If you go onto my website under newsletter, it will have one of the top messages is the link I sent out to everybody, to the my mailing list, and consequently you'll have the link on there. But it is online application, and it's quite an extensive description of what the program is, and consequently, or in addition, the actual online application form. So, okay, now we'll truly get into home composting here. One of wonderful things about compost is that you can do it as simple as just gathering a couple things together, some green stuff and some brown stuff, which I'll describe in a minute. Maybe just pieces of the lettuce and the green pepper and the cucumber that you created your salad in the evening. You know, the bad parts or the end tips and that kind of thing. Or you can really get into it in a complex manner, really measuring ingredients and following quite a few specific steps and using frames that you may transfer between. And we'll go into a lot of that, different kinds of approaches. But it's really up to you how you want to spend your time and get the particular results that you had in mind. So one of the first questions that comes to mind many times is, what's the difference between compost and mulch? And the whole thing is that compost is decomposed organic matter that you can't tell where everything came from. Like in this pile, the face, certainly you can identify those flowers and the foliage of some plants, but that nice rich brown stuff in there that's little bits and pieces, that's already composted. And that is when it has achieved that stage that you can go ahead and apply it to your garden. Now, mulch is also organic matter, but it may only be partially decomposed, like it could be those bits and pieces that you see right there, but you can tell what they came from. And it's generally laid on top of the soil, the mulch is, and then it just breaks down gradually. But part of the issue of letting something go ahead and compost to the point where you can't tell what the original pieces were is that then will release the nutrients directly into the soil. Whereas if you just lay stuff on top as mulch, because it is available to all the air, it will dry out and get all crispy and all that, which it needs to in order to break down, but it won't turn into that compost until it has the application of the water and mixed in with the green stuff and the brown stuff. So why should we bother making compost? It's really what nature does anyway, which is what we're letting it happen right in this compost pile here. But it really ends up breaking down all that materials when they are kept mixed together and moist and aerated. And the beneficial microbes, the bacteria, the fungi, all those little teeny tiny microorganisms are the ones that breaking down the material into its basic forms. And consequently, that is the nutrition that ends up being so, like fertilizer, a very mild fertilizer to the plants. So I've quoted here Cal Recycle and given you the URL on that. Home composting is an effective and efficient way to dramatically reduce your waste stream at home while doing your part to reduce your carbon footprint. Organic material sent to landfills creates methane, a powerful greenhouse gas, and contributes to the negative impacts of our changing climate. By making compost, you are creating a valuable soil amendment that you can use to benefit your landscape, boost plant growth, and sequester carbon. So it's all good stuff. This is more official language of what's happening just by breaking it down and absorbing it into the soil so that the roots can pull up those beneficial nutrients. So how do we start? Here's the definitional difference between the compost and the mulch. Here you can't tell what it used to be in there. It just feels like a nice fluffy soil that smells like a forest floor. Whereas mulch, this happens to be straw. It's just placed right on top of the soil. And of course, there's lots of benefits for this. It cuts the rain, it moderates the soil temperature, it moderates the air temperature, and it keeps weeds from sprouting because of the thickness of the layer. And any weeds that do manage to come through, they're so spindly because they've had to work their way up through this, and consequently, they're very easy to pull. So compost, this is what I had just read you. And this is a great graphic, I think. See all the little worms, and in the soil itself, they come up into what ends up being this great compost, and you use that in the soil, so to the benefit of all these vegetables there. So here's how you can start. Now these are containers. This is an enclosed container. This one's just a stable one. It's got all this ventilation on the sides. It's got a flat top to it. Same thing with this, it's enclosed. Here we've got a tumbler. Here, this is just some of that plastic that was put into a round shape with holes drilled in it and a top. Here is a trash bin that somebody has made this commercially available item in their own way, with drilling holes in the sides, but it's just a regular old trash bin. An open pile, you can see all these different variations of what people have put together. So pallets, this is my garden. These are pallets that are just strung together with the bungee cords. Here is a constructed one. Somebody had the frame, the wood frame, and it has chicken wire in between. This, if you'll believe it or not, this is a bed frame that they have sawed in half and made 4 sides out of it. So 2 beds. Here we've got like that original one with the top on it. This is the one without the top. More twisted chain link fence. This is bird netting on the side, strung around the 3 sides of the PVC pipe form. And you'll notice up front here, what they're using for a door is they've got the frame piece, but they've got this extra PVC pipe into which they fit these boards. See, here's the extra boards over here. And so they gradually pile this up as the pile gets larger. And then as it breaks down, they remove each of these slats in order to access what has become done compost. So here we've got the 3 bins. Here's many times, some of the community gardens will have a 4 bin. They'll have the, this is like a combination of the dried foliage, and then when they have the really wet stuff that they're putting into the pile, like when they pulled a bunch of weeds, or certainly later in January, my garden has a lot of its, the nasturtiums that have come up year after year. So I will pull a lot, those that are in the pathways, I will mix that with some of the dry stuff in this middle bin. And then as this breaks down, it gets transferred into the final bin, which is the compost that's ready to put into the garden. Now this is at one of the community gardens. They had the that fencing kind of metal fencing that they put into a round circle. They put the plastic trash bags, and then they had the plants that they planted through the side of it, which can access the roots, access the compost on the inside of it. So here it's a relatively attractive compost bin in the middle of their plot in the community garden. So here it's just concrete building blocks that are formed with or placed so that the holes can go straight through, so that allows in a lot of the air in order to circulate in there so it doesn't spoil. And here we've got more permanent concrete blocks that form the 3 bins. And here, a beautiful one using the pruned branches to interwoven so that it forms the container for what ends up being great compost. And there's also sheet composting, lasagna composting, because it's layers on layers on layers, just spread in there to break down. And the last one here is this Verma composting or worm composting. And this really is a dedicated container just for worm composting. This you can use indoors. And in fact, some of the instructors we had for the Master Gardener program advocated getting some of those bins, storage bins that the tops could be secured, and punch holes in it, breathing holes, and use that instead of purchasing the more official commercially available bins. But this system with the worm composting, you really, it's most applicable when you have only a small amount of kitchen waste, because you really don't want to overload the worms. And you really need to pay much closer attention to them than an outdoor area. Because frankly, when one of the examples that had come through of somebody who decided to no longer do the worm composting indoors, which by an aside is a wonderful way for kindergartners, teachers who are kindergarten teachers, to have the worm bin inside the classroom and then take the resulting wonderful soil compost out into the garden. But this person, I guess, forgot that they really had these live critters in their home. And when they went off on a vacation, and when they came home, there were dead worms all over the house, because of course the worms had tried to escape to go find food because they hadn't been fed or watered. So you have to pay closer attention as you deal with your worms. Okay, so what do you use in the compost pile? What it is a combination, generally about half green stuff, which is really moist stuff, and it has a lot of nitrogen in it. So examples of this are the fresh garden clippings, the grass clippings, foliage, green leaves, the vegetable and fruit trimmings when you're preparing your meals or pulling them off of the trees, coffee grounds, which I'll discuss in a minute, tea leaves, eggshells, weeds and vegetable plants, and manure from herbivorous animals. Only animals that eat green stuff, not meat. And these include chickens and turkeys, cows, horses, goats, and rabbits. you'll see in a minute that we don't want any meat eaters, like cats and dogs also have diseases that are transmutable to people. So you don't want to use those feces. Coffee grounds, you would think, are going to be very acidic and brown stuff. I mean, it's literally brown. But in fact, I did some research when I had great success putting a half-inch layer of coffee grounds directly onto my beds where I was going to be planting my peas one winter. And those peas just did such a tremendous job. All the nitrogen from what turned out to be nitrogen and a balanced set of nutrients from those coffee grounds just resulted in a tremendous pea crop. So this got me to do some more research about just what the benefits of coffee grounds were, because I had assumed that it was all just going to be acidic because coffee was acidic. But as I found out, it really is quite a balanced nutrient base. So, and you don't have to compost it before using it. You can put it directly onto, like a mulch, or dig it into the soil in your beds. Because initially I had thought, well, because it's acidic, I can only use it on my camellias and my roses. But because I had such a wonderful resource at our local Starbucks and Pete's and other coffee stores, I ended up really importing for about a year, importing a tremendous amount of it and applying it directly to the garden and all my fruit trees and the vegetable beds and literally everywhere. So I did do that further research and found that it was an excellent basic resource for the garden. And because you didn't have to compost it as well, it just seemed like a really good direct application. So it was a great finding for that. But it is indeed in the category that provides a lot of nitrogen as the greenery. So the brown stuff, these are providing the carbon part of the combination carbon plus nitrogen that ends up creating the mix for compost. And this includes dry grass clippings, small twigs, dried leaves, hay, shredded paper, wood chips, sawdust. But of course, you don't want the sawdust from any kind of treated wood. So be careful about your resource on that. Now, size, let's see if I'm doing this. Okay. The size of the pieces, this is all pretty fine-grained stuff, but you don't want big chunks of things. Like if you chop down a sunflower bush, don't just put the whole thing in there. Of course, one of my master gardeners got a huge kitchen knife and was hacking everything into 2-inch bits before he would put it into his compost pile. And he really got into this. He was getting the greenery that came from a local restaurant that was going to be thrown away. And he just had this whole big cutting board system set up, and he was hacking away at this stuff every day, giving himself several inches worth of greenery to add to his several compost piles that were in various degrees of breaking down. So you truly can get into this, but the smaller pieces, especially of the dry brown material, will decompose more quickly just because there's a lot more surface area that is now open for all those microorganisms to connect with each one of those bits and pieces. And especially with the dried leaves, the dried grass clippings, and even especially the fresh grass clippings, you don't want to have it be a solid layer. You really want to crunch it up and break it up so that there's a lot of air traveling in between all those pieces. And the soil that you add as well, or the compost from a previous batch, all of that will accentuate the speed and get it all going to decompose much more quickly. Now, for the quickest decomposition, you want to use about 1 part nitrogen and green material to 2 parts carbon and brown material. Because the green stuff will break down much more quickly, and because it has all that moisture in it, you want it to be mixed in sufficiently with the brown stuff so that it doesn't just if it's green and it mushes down into itself, it's going to start stinking because it's called anaerobic. It does not have any air in it. So this is why it's a 1 part green to 2 parts brown. Okay, what should you not include? Let me see, did I even, there we go. Okay, this was a great graphic that I pulled from the web, and I thought, well, now this really shows what it all is. Greens and browns composting. Think wet, nitrogen rich, fruits and vegetables, eggshells, grass, flowers, coffee grounds, fresh leaves. The browns, think dry, carbon rich, twigs and sticks, egg cartons. Now, obviously, these are the pressed paper cartons. These are not the styrofoam cartons. Old leaves, dried stuff, newspaper, sawdust, hay, and straw. Now, hay has a likelihood of the seeds in it. So you don't want to choose that if you have the option, because we're going to be covering that here. So the things you want to avoid: you don't want any animal products, the meat, the bones, the dairy, anything fat with fat or oil in it. The feces from meat-eating animals like dogs, cats, and humans, any diseased or pest infested plant material. So like even at the end of the season, when I'm pulling up all my tomato plants, because tomatoes as a family can be very susceptible to lots of diseases and pests, I never put my tomato plants into my compost pile, even if it looks like a beautifully clean plant. So be cautious as you are pulling things from your garden, and really make sure that they are nice, clean, healthy plants, so to speak. At least they were before they died at the end of the season, before you put them in your compost pile. Because once you put something, and this also goes for weeds, if the weed plant has any visual clue that it is starting to mature those seeds, for example, these flowers here, even especially this, if it's already in flower or if it's set the pod of the seeds, don't put it into your compost pile, because it may go ahead, if it has several weeks before it is absolutely dead, it will mature those seeds, and then you will be potentially spreading them all through your compost pile. and consequently then into your garden. That's certainly the last thing you want to have in your garden. So that's definitely one kind of recycling that you don't want. Okay, how do you put this whole thing together? Again, the small pieces, 1 part green to 2 parts brown. So this has the what looks like tomato foliage sitting on top of a lot of different hay. And you can see that underneath here too. And so you see how they're spreading out the different pieces here. You're not making a solid layer of it. Better to make very, very many individual little layers than a big clump of it. So you generally, the university has found that 3 by 3 by 3 feet is really the optimum for decomposition. A friend of mine up in Davis, they lived on a street that had these really old, beautiful trees. And of course, tons, literally tons of leaves came down in the fall. So he would sweep them up onto the edge of his property so that he had about a 12-foot wide pile. And the way he handled that, because he had such a tremendous number and quantity of all those leaves, he made kind of more like a donut, so that it was about 3 feet high, but it was like a donut going all the round, so that it was 3 foot from the center to the outer edge, and it went around in a circle, so that he could be in the center of it and kind of scoop those up and into the pile. And he would turn it, the whole donut, about once a week. And so he did end up with a lot of tremendous compost. And because it was under those trees, even though they had dropped their leaves, just because of the amount of rain that they had, and all those leaves broke down very nicely. He didn't need to add any of the green stuff because the moisture of that was inherent in the leaves and as the everyday weather, it ended up being a tremendous project. And certainly he got his exercise turning those piles. But my point is that that 3 by 3 by 3 foot, he did accomplish, even though he had such a tremendous amount of material to deal with. So in creating the pile, about a 4 to 6 inch base layer of coarse, dry brown material. And this would include maybe some of those branches that are even a 1/2 inch in diameter, kind of making a base on it that has the space for the air penetration. And then adding a 2 to 3 layer of green materials, and then alternating a layer of brown materials, and then a dusting of dirt or mature compost or used potting mix. So what I have in my garden that looks very similar to this, well, it's the pallets. I have the pile as it has started. And then when I bring the stuff from the kitchen, I have just a big gallon size container that I collect my clippings from the lettuce and all that stuff that I prepare the meals. I will spread that on the whole area of the compost pile. And then I have a bucket that has the used potting mix when I have repotted some of my container plants. I will sprinkle that on, and that will help absorb the moisture from the green stuff. And then on top of that, I put the leaves from my oak tree and other brown stuff on top of that. And then I sprinkle it once on top like that. So each layer may in fact be only an inch deep. And it has all of those elements to it: the green stuff, the brown stuff, the dirt or compost or potting mix, and then a sprinkling on top, which kind of then gets those microorganisms happy on all those different layers and pulling it through. Now, during hot and dry weather, like the end of our springs and certainly all the way through summer, you may have to moisten the pile more frequently, just because in between adding the layers. And during wet weather, it would be nice to think that if we had more rain, you may need to cover the pile to shed off the rainwater, because you don't want the rain to be leaching all those materials, the nutrients, down into the soil underneath that compost pile. So how long will it take? A hot pile, which means that all those organisms are so active and they're just really going at it. And you can stick your hand into maybe 6 inches down into the pile and you literally feel heat. You may need to turn it and re-moisten it every couple days, and you'll have the finished compost in a month or so. The cold pile, you just make those layers and then you leave it as it is. And you may turn it once or twice, but it really is much less effort. And that's what I do, because years ago I was doing so much gardening that I injured my back, and consequently I can't do any of that kind of stuff anymore. Consequently, I pay much closer attention to putting those layers in properly, and then that enables the microorganisms to travel between the layers themselves. So the cold pile, you really can't feel the heat, except perhaps the day after you put some in, as the microorganisms are really revving up between the nitrogen and getting it mixed in with brown stuff because of that moisture. So consequently, my compost may take 6 months or a year. So basically, I will have my compost pile running year round. And then in the fall, I have some helpers come and they sort through the compost. They don't really filter it, but they remove the big pieces, like pieces of branches and stuff that haven't decomposed. And that goes into a side bin that I use to start the next compost pile. And then they distribute all that compost that has composted sufficiently. That goes out into the garden. So how do I know when compost is done? It needs to be, if you remember that handful that was at the very beginning of the presentation, it's uniform, it's dark brown, and it's crumbly. And it's a pleasant aroma. It smells kind of earthy, you know, like you're walking through a forest floor. And you can't recognize any of the original materials. There is no expiration date, in a sense. It would be wise to cover the compost if you're going to be having any rain or overhead irrigation or something like that, because it literally will wash all that good nutrients down into the soil underneath the compost. It will continue to cure and kind of continue breaking down, but it will be pretty much slower because there's like a peak, like when I suggest putting compost onto a bed with your manure and your compost at the beginning of when you're going to be renovating your raised bed before planting seedlings and seeds, that you need to leave it go for about 2 weeks, because that's the time that it heats up. It does, the microorganisms are in there eating all that wonderful stuff that you provided. And then when it cools down, that's when you can go ahead and plant your seedlings or your seeds. If you do it before then, chances are it's literally going to get burned, the roots, or the seeds will get burnt up. And that's what I was saying, when you stick your hand into the hot compost pile, it may be too hot for you to keep your hand in there. You pull it out immediately. So bad things do happen in compost piles. And this is, I think, what keeps a lot of people from even attempting it, because they're afraid of some of the bad things that can happen. So here's 3. If it's too wet and it smells bad, the beneficial microbes, bacteria, and fungi have died. And it's literally not enough air in there. They literally have suffocated, and they're starting to rot in a bad way, because that is the bad smell. What you should do is then incorporate more carbon and brown material, turn and fluff the pile to incorporate that air, and the dry materials to reactivate it. If it's too dry, you may get a lot of ants nesting in there. And I have found this more than once, where during the summer, the pile really kind of doesn't do much. It's just sitting there because it has been so dry and I haven't watered it. And then when I start to turn it, or when I do water it, I find all these ants coming out of there. And many times they'll be carrying their little eggs on top of them. They'll just be holding this thing up. And that's when you know that it has been creating a nest in there, because it was just the dry end of a little bit of moisture. So you add more nitrogen and green material, you turn and moisten the pile to reactivate it. And meanwhile, those ants are streaming out and going somewhere else. And that's how you keep them out of your pile, by making sure that you have watered it sufficiently, so that it's just that nice, moist, kind of wrung out sponge kind of moisture to it. And lastly, when we have both insects in there or bigger critters like rats and raccoons, it's probably because there has been meat or fatty foods in the pile. And of course, remove those items, turn and moisten it, and you may need to go to one of those closed containers so that they don't have access in there. Now, be aware that when you're turning your compost, you may see like white filaments, like as if a whole bunch of string was in there. This is good fungi, so don't think something's wrong with it. Some insect pests, you will find the pupas in there, when they look like a big worm or a casing. These may be just some of the other, not necessarily bad insects in the garden, but there is a worm thing that is, I can't remember which one it is now, but it's not something to get excited about. Certainly it looks like there's foreign critters in your compost pile. So just if you're concerned about those, just turn it and then take those, put them on the dirt and smash it. Get rid of it that way. So how do I use compost in my garden? This is what you've done it for, all this process, and now your garden gets to benefit. So this is how you can use it and what you end up benefiting your garden for any soil type, whether it's sandy soil or whether it's hard clay soil. It really is good for everything. It's the magic ingredient amendment. So it helps sandy soil to retain the water because you're mixing all this spongy kind of stuff into the sandy soil, which drains super quickly. Now you're incorporating this organic matter in order to keep the water moist, but still all that air pores in between are wide open to take in the water, but then to slowly drain it. And that's where all the roots of the plants go, is into those air pores to pick up that water. It helps clay soil to drain better. So you see what I'm saying? It's the magic ingredient that does opposite things in both opposite kinds of soils. It retains the water in sandy soil, but it drains the water in clay soil. So it ends up being just the best thing that you can provide in your garden. It improves the soil structure friability, and this just means that you can work in it all more easily. You're not dealing with just this sandy stuff that falls apart, and you're not dealing with this clay soil that ends up in a brick every summer because it just dries out. It's just always nice and usable in the garden. Now, one of the critical things that it does enable your plants to be all the happier and healthier is that those nutrients in that plant matter were broken down, and so now they are more immediately available to the plant roots. And consequently, the plant can pull up that nutrient sooner and end up putting it into the plant to produce more foliage and more fruits, if that's for the flowers. And of course, healthier plants can more easily resist diseases and pests. So that's, you know, really what the ultimate thing is. You're making healthier plants. And that's the whole point. And that's it. Oh, here, I forgot to give you this. All right. The great thing about shopping for gardeners, 10 yards of compost. Oh, you do love me. You can give us rotten crap and we'll be happy. And that's the gardener in all of us, I'm sure. And here's the happy compost pile. That's it.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. We do have a number of questions, so I will go through the list here. First two are from Nicole. Her first question is, at what point do you stop adding to your existing composting pile so you can actually use it, or do you add it continually up until you use it?
Yes. You do anything that you want, however it works best for you. Many systems, more official systems, do want you to create a pile all at once and cover it and let it do its thing and then utilize it. Because of the nature of my gardening and my garden, mine is a constant constant adding. The point at which in the fall that I have my helpers put the compost into the beds to renovate, amend those beds for my fall crops, that is the momentary shift. They sort out the bigger pieces to utilize as the beginning of the next pile, and then they take all of that compost and spread it amongst the many beds that I have. So within one day, it was having something added, but the next day, that stuff is all sorted out and the compost is moved to the beds and the next pile is started. So that's why that cold compost pile is the development for mine. At many of the community gardens, they have 4 or 5 or more of those pallet sections, and they literally move it and turn it into the next bin. And then they're also always starting a new bin and proceeding with these other stages along the way. So partly as a measure of the amount of space that you have in the garden, so that you know how many bins you would like to have, or if you just have, I guess 2 would be the minimum, because one, you're building it, and then the other one, you may be keeping the dry stuff in that's not going to decompose because it doesn't have any of the green stuff, and you're just kind of using it as a holding bin. And then that begins the new pile once you have taken all the done stuff and distributed that into the garden. So it can be either way. It's whichever system is going to work best for you.
Thank you. And Nicole also asked, can you use flavored coffee grinds?
Yeah, I wouldn't think there'd be any issue about that. You mean like vanilla coffee, or I wouldn't think that would have any effect at all.
Thank you. And from Kerwa, how do you use compost? Just spread it around the garden or mix it into the soil, and at what ratio?
You can do whatever you want. You can put it on top just as a mulch. I find that helpful to do when I am just sowing my lettuces or carrots or the beets, you know, the kinds of plants that are root plants like carrots and beets and even leeks, where you really want to sow it in place because those roots are going to go straight down and they don't transplant well because they've got that tap root going down. I would put a layer of the compost on that bed and then sow the seed, just scatter it in there. And then that will have a nice rich base that has the nice moist, nutrient-rich compost for those seeds to be able to germinate in, and consequently, every time you water that area, the nutrients go further down into the soil, and consequently, those roots are well fed. If you choose to dig it in, which is what I do every year in the fall, to the depth of my spading fork, which is about maybe 8 inches, I will put the layer of fertilizer like manure, and then an equal layer of maybe 2 inches of the compost. And then I will turn that soil to the depth of the spading fork. So it'll be the root zone for any plants that grow in there will be about 6, 7, 8 inches. Are we on still?
My apologies, I was on mute. Let me read that again. I have a tumbler. This is from Nicole. I have a tumbler, so there really are no layers because everything is mixed up constantly. Is that detrimental versus a non-tumbler composting?
No, because the whole point is it is doing the turning that you're not having to do with a regular stable pile. So that's fine, just as long as you keep real track of the balance of your dries and greens materials in there, so that you don't end up having it be too dry or too green and going mushy, because it is a closed system. So it's very critical that you have that correct balance.
Thank you. Next is from Jeannie. I grow tomatoes in very large containers. Is it okay to throw the container soil into the compost pile?
Absolutely. That's what I use, is that middle connection. After I put my greens down, I put the potting mix down, and it also seems to serve as a bit of a deodorizer, because then the brown stuff on top and then sprinkling on top of that. So you've always got those like 4 layers. You've got green, you've got the potting soil, you've got the brown, and then you've got the moisture on top. But, you know, use it as a thin layer. Don't dump the whole pot in just for one layer. Just keep that pot off to the side and then sprinkle in some of it every time that you create another layer.
Our next question is from Jamie. What tools do you recommend for turning and maintaining compost?
I use my spading fork. Here, the spading fork here. Now I have the really long handled one that I got years ago because I utilize it in the garden. But for a compost pile, you can have the short handle one, you know, with the D handle on it. And that works fine.
Next question is from Padma. Is it okay to dig a hole around a plant and put the food scraps and cover with soil? Will it compost?
Yeah, that's what my mom did. My dad and I would do a lot of fishing during the summer. And so what she always did, there was one bed where she would always grow the corn each year. And she would get the clippings from, you know, the lettuce and all that stuff as she prepared the meals. And then when we would come home with the fish, she would put one of those, the clump of the greenery and the fish heads and the skins and all that into a hole, cover it up. And that, of course, would have a lot of leaves in it as well, the brown stuff. And then she would cover it, and she'd put a stick in there so that she would know where it was, and consequently where the next hole would be dug. So inside of the entire summer, if you think of this, I'm trying to make a sheet here. Maybe here's the bed as a hole. So she would start here, and then the hole next, each one, she would go down right next to it, digging another hole and burying that stuff. So by the end of the summer, that entire bed had all these diggings in there with holes. Now, and then that next summer, when all of that had decomposed over the winter, that would be the perfect place for planting the corn, because corn is extremely high feeder, heavy feeder of nitrogen. So all that perfect nitrogen that went into that bed was now available for that corn. She did find, however, that she had to get bird netting or something to put over the bed, because of course all the neighborhood cats would come trying to dig up the fish heads. So she did find that she needed to put the fruit tree netting over that entire bed, because she found it was a deterrent, because the cats didn't want to get their claws all mixed up in with this netting that they couldn't see. So the short answer is yes, it will decompose.
Great. And there's a quick follow-up question from Jamie. Wouldn't that attract rodents digging in your garden?
Well, fish certainly has some fat to it, but she never mentioned that that was an issue, so I don't know.
Our next question is from Tom. Should we be concerned about putting too many citrus in the compost pile? Are citrus seeds an issue? And should we be concerned about fruit rats?
I don't think so, unless you, again, make a thin layer, a single layer of, if you're squeezing a lot of the fruits or whatever it is, just to make a thin layer of it, you know, one rind deep, so to speak, and then put your brown stuff and your potting mix on there. I know there have been some recommendations that say you should never use citrus in your pile, and I never quite understand why that saying that any is an issue.
And a question from Marion. Any suggestions on where to find more greens? I have lots of dry leaves waiting to be composted. Yeah,
this is a real issue as we move through the year. At some point you have, you know, tons of green stuff, and then other times you don't have much at all. And then it works the reverse for your brown stuff. Certainly you can check up and down your street with your neighbors. If anybody maybe has a lawn, but they don't put herbicides and stuff into it, maybe getting their bags of clippings, or just checking around. I don't know now so much because of the COVID issues, but there have been quite a few of our master gardeners did have access to restaurants that would be throwing away all this great, you know, vegetable preparation stuff. And so they would go and collect it once a week or something, whatever worked out schedule wise for them. So they had a partnership just on an individual basis with like a pizza place or a regular restaurant or whatever, just to be able to take some of that green stuff and put that into their garden compost piles.
Our next
So
question.
just be searching around and trying to find something that's relatively local to you that will be worth your making the effort.
Great. Our next question is from Elizabeth. How often should I turn the closed container? We have one that spins.
Well, there may be certainly every time that you add stuff, which I would assume would be at least twice a week, and I would think that would be fine. You know, certainly more than once a week. Just because it's closed, you do have to be more attentive to turning it and flipping it, however it does move, to reconnect all those individual pieces inside there than you do if it's an open pile that has the access to the air. Because once it's an enclosed bin, like the tumblers, they really are closed, and it's consequently very little access to air getting in there. So you do have to make such much greater effort at making sure that everything is combining well, mixed into the greens and browns very well.
And I have a couple of, I think not quite compost related questions, but gardening questions. I'm going to circle back around to that at the end, but I have a couple more compost ones. From Marion, did you mention anything about grubs? I remove them when I find them. Are they of any benefit, or is it a bad sign when I get them?
Grubs? Was that the word?
Yes. Grubs, yeah.
Sometimes they're just regular critters that are good in the garden. Sometimes they're not. You might try to get an identification of what they are before you get worried about it and try to be pulling them out. There are a lot of things that are just regular kinds of beneficial grubs, shall we say, that, you know, it'll turn into an adult that is very useful in the garden, and others aren't. So try to find out, you know, put one in a Ziploc bag and take it to an Armstrong nursery or one of the independent nurseries where they actually have staff that know stuff, and try to get it identified. And then you'll know whether to make an effort to remove it or to just let it do its thing in there.
And a question from Elizabeth. Elizabeth says, I have trouble finding natural brown items. Is it okay to use lots of newspaper?
Yeah, newspaper is fine. Years ago, there was an issue with using the colored supplements. And over the years, I think everything now is a soy-based ink. However, it's still not advisable to use the colored supplements like the ads and the coupons and all that stuff. So just use the regular newsprint section of the newspaper. And, you know, cutting it up in strips is better because you want that to be, again, smaller pieces. If you laid the whole sheet on there, it potentially would be like a grass clipping mat, that it would become impervious to the water.
Thank you. And our next three questions are from Joyce. Her first question is, do you have a video I can watch to show me how to prune my rose bush?
I don't, but I'm sure there are a ton of them on YouTube. I think, I wonder, I remember an event. Let me get on my website here. Under events, there was one, I think it was at the Arboretum, was doing a, you know, usually every year, all these botanic gardens used to have hands-on pruning, but because of COVID, they're not. But I think I remember one of them coming up as a video or something. Of course, this is taking a while to load here. Okay. But I think, you know, if you go on YouTube, and just put in pruning roses, there is one of my, let me, okay, here we are. All right. Now this is on my website under events, submit your event. And on January 30th and 31st, from 10 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon, there's an annual rose pruning workshop at Dominguez Rancho Adobe Museum. So that is a hands-on one, and I think it's let me go to the announcement. Limited capacity. So they're going to be, participants will receive snacks, refreshments, light lunch, and your very own succulent plant. So they're doing a hands-on, a very much social distancing and wearing a mask and all that, the safety protocols. So that would be a hands-on version of it. But also, if you go onto my website and under blog, there is on the right-hand side, there is the search bar. It's right above where it says archives. So if you put in there pruning roses, then it will come up with all the different articles that I have written about pruning roses. So so those have lots of photos as well as the step-by-step instructions. So that's how you can have access just on my website. But certainly the visual of it is what is so helpful. So that may be on the YouTube, and I would recommend watching several of them, because everybody has their own techniques, and sometimes you get a little confused because one person will say one thing and another person will say something that seems to be opposite or at least very distinct. So those are my two suggestions.
Thank you. Joyce's next question is, how do I revive my potted azalea? I put too many coffee grounds on the top of the soil. Then I took the excess amount off later when I noticed the plant wasn't doing well. I put new potting soil, but I think the poor plant is in shock. I have had the plant for 5 years, and until I over-fertilized with coffee grounds, the plant was fine.
Okay. How large is the pot? I mean, if you mix stuff in and use a new potting mix, you know, be aware that it's dormant now, so it may not look very happy, but that may be just because it's the season it is. But you can just generally, with any plant that needs a renovated soil mix, just remove it, you know, water it well so all that soil is moist, and then remove it from the pot and just kind of finger it away, all of that soil mix. And maybe if it's an extensive root system, just trim the outer edges of it, and then put it back in the pot with all new potting mix. I can't imagine that the coffee grounds, because there's such a minimal amount of nutrition in there, that would have caused the problem. Maybe it was just overwatering or something, a combination of different kinds of cultural issues. But certainly just repotting it in a completely new potting mix will be of help no matter what. But just water it sufficiently in order to connect the roots with all that new potting mix, rather than so that it doesn't potentially get overwatered now that it is dormant before it starts putting out its new growth.
And Joyce commented as a follow-up, I thought I might have burned the roots.
Not with the coffee grounds, because it's a much minimal thing. But you will see what's going on once you remove all that soil mix and add the new mix. But even if they look brown, it doesn't, you know, if you clip at it a little bit and you see the white interior, then you know that the root is still alive. But in any case, just repot it completely with new mix, water it in so it drains nicely out of the bottom of the pot, and then just keep it in the bright light, but no direct light for at least a month, just so that it can reconnect as it starts to regrow again for the spring.
Great. And our final question, my chrysanthemums were planted in the spring. They bloom beautifully in the fall. Now they look brown and unattractive. Are they going dormant or are they dead?
No, they're just going dormant. You can prune back to about 4 or 5 inches, just so you know where they are in the garden. You know that there's a clump there, and that's it. It will spread in the soil a little bit, and then it'll come up nicely later in the spring and early summer. So it's doing fine. It's supposed to do that.